thesis, ideologies and the role of ideas in the activities of political parties. She's particularly interested in understanding how ideas rise and fall out of fashion, a theme she explored in her doctoral thesis, the Labour Party and the idea of work, which she successfully defended at the LSE in 2002. Her last book was The Labour Party under Ed Miliband, Trying but Failing to Renew Social Democracy. The book explored how the Labour Party adopted and adapted old and new ideas for its 2015 electoral manifesto. In 2022, she won the Michael Freeden Prize for the best article published in the Journal of Political Ideologies. Ideas and party change, Predistribution and Socialist Renewal in the Labour Party under Ed Miliband. She has continued to research and publish on the ideas of the Labour Party, and she's currently working on a short introduction to European social democracy, which will be published in 2024 by Agenda Public. Once again, President Eunice Goes, voice to voice and more voice building countervailing power in the age of the Polycrisis. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the very generous invitation to address you this morning. I was a little bit nervous because, as Rafael explained, my field of expertise is slightly different from the fields around global studies and the field that covers all the social movements. So you'll see that I have actually quite a lot to learn from you. But first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, which was a great honor to be addressing you this morning and to open the conference of the Global Studies Research Network. As Rafael said, I am a political scientist who has written in research the area of how ideas influence politics, how those ideas can also affect change. I've also conducted some research in the past about deliberative democracy. So I hope that what I have to say to you today is relevant to the field of global studies and social movements. And I also hope that it addresses the topic of the conference on agency in an era of change and displacement. So as the prompt of the conference suggests, we are living through a moment of great turbulence and potential transformation. The world we inhabit is in a state of flux. It is difficult to make sense of the world, what is happening around us, and even harder to glimpse what lies ahead of us. Some social scientists define such moments as critical junctures. And a critical juncture is that fork in the road moment that is pregnant with possibilities which can lead to transformative change. However, it often results in stasis. In fact, the last 15 years are illustrative of the combination of the potential for transformational change and stasis. As historian Adam Tooze noted, and he's essentially the author of the idea of polycrisis, we are living this polycrisis, which according to him, we are experiencing big, turbulent, painful crises that have appended the terms of the political debate about how the world functions and how it should be organized. Crucially, the cumulative effect of these multiple and simultaneous crises is a general sense of disorientation, but also a sense of powerlessness. I think it is worth listing the many multiple crises that have created so much disruption in our world in the last 2 decades. So we had the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, which reverberated across the world. We live in a refugee crisis, which has been ongoing since at least 2015. We're experiencing multiple manifestations of a climate emergency around the world, an emergency which poses an existential threat to all forms of life in our planet. We've also been witnessing the rise of political polarization, manifested in the rise to power of strong men who show little respect for the rule of law and democracy. We've lived through a pandemic that shut down the entire planet and which created the worst global economic crisis of the last 100 years, according to the World Bank. Since last year, we've been experiencing a new world war in Europe, which has global ramifications. And we continue to see the uneven distribution of global power resulting in the continued exploitation of the global north by the global south, which is often manifest in war, in violence, in famines, and displacement. It really matters worse the way that all these crises interact with each other, have intensified them, and have prolonged them too. Historical institutionalists say that successive external shocks like the ones we are experiencing and I just described, they open the moment for very short periods of time, they open the moment for a window of opportunity. And that window of opportunity is for transformative change. And this is so because at times of uncertainty, there are times where the old certainties about how the world works have guided actions, guided action. They are friction cell ideas, and so policymakers in those conditions are normally more open to new ideas, to make sense of what is happening, to reorder the world, and find solutions to old and new problems. In fact, right on cue, the French president Emmanuel Macron, when he was confronted with the pandemic, he noted that we are faced with a very profound anthropological, political, and geopolitical opportunity. So, crisis upon crisis, open windows of opportunities for transformative change. But as historical institutionalists and other theorists of change have noted, transformative change does not solely depend on the perfect alignment between a crisis and a perfect idea. Indeed, hundreds of windows of opportunities have been missed by progressive forces. And they were missed not because those progressive forces were wrong, but because they were powerless. In 2008, the death of neoliberalism was announced by hundreds of oracles. And at the time, it looked counterintuitive, almost irrational, that neoliberalism would survive what looked like a fatal crisis of capitalism. And yet, neoliberalism not only survived, but it has metamorphosed into new trident variants. So, how do we get out of this quandary? Historical institutionalists argue that for that transformative change to happen, all the conditions need to connect. So all the conditions other than the existence of ideas. Peter Hall has proposed three criteria to test the power of ideas in processes of what he calls urban change, and which we can call as charismatic change. First, he says that plausible and persuasive ideas that offer an alternative to the status quo, they need to be available. And this does not mean that those alternatives must be good and effective. Indeed, often terrible ideas, or what Mark White calls zombie ideas, they win, and we all pay the price for the adoption and success of those terrible ideas. So the persuasiveness of ideas is only highly dependent on their intellectual coherence or of their technical viability. So in order to be persuasive, they need to be comprehensible, according to Hall. They need to resonate with the way that the recipients of the idea and policymakers do it, they understand well. But thirdly, ideas can influence policy. An idea must come to the attention to those who make policy, generally with a favorable endorsement from the relevant authorities. Crucially, the endorsement of a new idea can potentially result in its adoption will depend, as Hall explained, and I quote, not only on the arguments of competing factions, but on their positional advantages within a broader institutional framework, on the ancillary resources they can command in the relevant conflicts, and all the exogenous factors affecting the power of one set of actors to impose its paradigm over others. So because it brings into equation considerations about power, this third criteria is perhaps the most important one. Indeed, this third criteria explains why bad ideas are often the most, on a regular basis, adopted by policymakers. They are adopted because cunning policy and ideas entrepreneurs have grabbed the moment decisively and convince, confuse, and undecided policymakers to follow a particular course of action. There is, of course, an element of luck in that process, but most of it is a question of agency and power. So change happens because policymakers are making choices, but these choices are often the real reflections of society's unequal distribution of power. So to be influential and transformative, ideas need to be sponsored by powerful actors. So that guides us into the way in which citizens and social movements can be able to exercise their agency in an effective way. And I think that the key condition for the exercise of citizens' agency in this world of flux is a solid understanding of power and how power is understood and exercised. Above all, it is important to understand that power is unevenly distributed in the world, including in democracy. And why is that the case? In the 1960s, Robert Dahl and Charles Lyndon theorized about the pro-business bias of little democracies. They argued that business interests had a disproportionate influence in policy making because they had the power to decide whether an economy was growing, whether employment was up or down, and so on. With that influence, those corporate interests gained even more power. Legislation covering everything from employment rights to data protection to climate change has been done and is increasingly done by those corporate influence. And as Barats and Bartak explain in their two phases of power theory, this unequal distribution of power in our society that awards corporate interests so much influence is reproduced to the agenda setting process at EU level. But this unequal distribution of power is not destiny. This unequal distribution of power can be challenged. The power of capital is dominant. After all, businesses have captured policy making in all democratic and non-democratic regimes of the world. But capital is not a divine force. Citizens and social movements have the capacity to mobilize what the economist J.K. Galbraith defined as the countervailing power, in effect, transformative change. We've seen this happen countless of times. In the early 19th century, the labor movement campaigned for universal rights, for universal suffrage, and the extension of new economic and social rights. We saw also the force of that countervailing power again in the 20th century, when anti-imperialist and independentist movements expelled European colonial powers from African, Asian, and Latin American countries. In Latin America, was slightly early in the 19th century. And also in the 20th century, when we saw trade unions leading the call for workers' rights and for the development of welfare states. We saw it again with the powerless campaign for democracy in Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and in the 1980s. We saw again the force of that countervailing power of organized workers and social movements, when multinationals had to lobby governments and international organizations to weaken the power of trade unions and block any attempts to give genuine power to workers in the workplace. And I think in the last 2 decades, we saw how the climate movement forced global elites to start addressing the climate emergency before it is too late. So in each instance, the countervailing power of organized citizens and social movements transformed societies for the better. So to win this power struggle, and it is a power struggle, citizens and social movements must deploy their most powerful weapon. As Albert Richmond argued, voice is political action for excellence. But to be effective, social movements and citizens need to contend with the implications of society's unequal distribution of power and calibrate their voice for greater effect. As Peter Hall argued, the power of citizens' voices is dependent on the ancillary resources they can command in this particular settings. So, after all, citizens also did not rely on the support of powerful actors who can sponsor their agendas and their ideas. For that reason, they need to deploy all the tools that make the best use of their capacities and position in the hierarchy of power. So the voice has to be calibrated to different expressions and manifestations. And as Hirschman put it, voice is a far more messy concept because it can be graduated all the way from faint grounding to violent protest. It implies articulation of one's political opinion rather than a private, secret vote in the anonymity of a supermarket. And finally, it is direct and straightforward rather than roundabout and vote. So voice can be angry, voice can inspire, and voice can also be extremely powerful. And voice also requires quite a lot of courage. So to be powerful, voice should be deployed in a variety of ways. Most of them Those ways are familiar to the scholars and activists of social movements, but also in other ways which lead to the greater organization, but also institutionalization of civil society into a greater dialogue with established political institutions. So the point that I'm making here is that the projection of voice can also serve a variety of goals. And in the rest of my talk, I will concentrate on two goals in which the voice of civil society can achieve. One of them is the agenda setting which involves the widening of terms of the political debate by inserting new issues, new topics on the political agenda. And the second goal is about actively participating in decision making. So as you know much better than me, there are many organic and creative ways of developing that countervailing power, which has the capacity to widen and influence political debates on a variety of issues. There are many wonderful and successful examples of this type of voice, but today I want to talk to you about the inspiring work of the Argentinian artist Eunice Goes, which I saw recently in London, and which I think represents a very powerful way of exercising agency through voice in a way that is congenial with the culture and the practices of social movements. As Monique pointed out, democratic activity is also reflected in the acts of cultural dissent, subversion, and reinvention in a range of social settings. So this is an image of one of Thomas Saraceno's work, which is these webs of lives, which is part of the project Arachnophilia. Now, Saraceno has shown through his art how citizens of social movements can find and exercise their agency in a way that transforms society. In fact, his work, which is built from wide and diverse collaborations with artists, philosophers, scientists, activists, teachers, gives agency not only to people. He also believes that art and the natural world can have active agency. So Saraceno's visions of new forms of life in common are markedly idealistic in their erasure of territorial boundaries and social exclusions. He presents his prototypes as a new form of liberation, explaining that so far we have seen freedom of movement and capital amongst the people. So, for example, in this work he has hybrid schemes of spiders, showing that they are created through the social power of those networks. In the various iterations of his Arachnophilia or hybrid webs project, he has mixed spiders from different parts of the world, and together they collaborate and weave these very large, intricate, unique, and beautiful webs. These are very fragile structures, and in fact, showing this fragility is a key component of Saraceno's art. But I think there are more powerful messages in his work. Firstly, the collaboration prompts a reflection about our coexistence with the natural world. Secondly, the web weaving by a hybrid and transnational team of spiders is a key component in the maintenance and protection of balanced ecosystems. So these are all images from these different Arachnophilia projects, which are, I think, quite an inspiring way of promoting that a greater coexistence with all different species of our planet. He has another project which is called the Aeroscene, which he proposes as an alternative to the Anthropocene. And this project, the Aeroscene, also carries important aspects of today's social movements, and crucially shows that the politics of possibilities is viable. As Joanna Page explained, by promoting free access to the atmosphere, the Aeroscene imagines space as a commons and becomes a physical and imaginative place clear from corporate control and government surveillance. For example, in his Flying with Kasha project launched in 2020, which is on explicit the images in these two pictures, it involved the documentation of the first flight of an aerosol balloon over the vast flats of Salinas Grandes in Argentina. This was the first ever fossil fuel-free human flight without burners, solar panels, batteries, helium, or hydrogen. The project involved as well the lobbying of the Federal Aviation Administration to define a category for solar flights, present for the recognition of air solar technology as a viable new form of mobility. So by seeking this recognition and legitimation, Saracen is reclaiming the airspace from corporate interests and enacting the paradigm shift that is needed to take us into this new era of decarbonization. But a second and very powerful component of this aerosol project involved a campaign against the exploitation of lithium in the lands of Argentina, Peru, Chile, and Bolivia, which is an exploitation which threatens the livelihoods of communities in this part of the world, and which is a key component of Europe's green transition. So this component of the aerosol project happened earlier this year in Alfacito, in the Argentinian province of Jujuy, in collaboration with the communities of Salinas Grandes and the Laguna de Guayaquil Basin, together with scientists, lawyers, philosophers, sociologists, and climate activists. This gathering attracted the attention of the world media, which reported about it, but culminated in the declaration that the area of Salinas Grandes in the Laguna or Guayaquil Basin is a subject of rights. This declaration, which is supported by international treaties and conventions, aspires to become a new legal framework that enables ecosystems and non-human species to have the same protection and rights as people and corporations. So with this project, Saracenu's work suggests a different way of doing politics, one that is not so much shaped by the languages and divisions of traditional ideologies, but one, to use the words of the French philosopher Bruno Latour, with whom Saraceno has collaborated, is one form of politics that proposes a politics that moves individuals into active engagement and dialogue, not driven by ideology, but by interactive action and participation in self, and which includes, crucially, non-human agents. So Saracenu's work is just one example that illustrates the agency and the capacity of citizens and social movements to widen the terms of the debate about climate change, to agenda set, and crucially to enable citizens to exercise their agency. But there are other ways to enable citizens to influence decision making and to participate directly in that decision making. And funnily enough, I think that the Saracenu's work in Alfacito suggests how that can be made. And so I'm now going to talk on how the voices of civil society can involve a form of institutionalization, for want of a better term. So this form of voice that I'm talking here is one that involves some form of institutionalization, but crucially does not imply the co-optation by powerful institutions, though it is often seen in that way by social movements and by the scholars of the public sphere and democracy. So the institutionalization of civil society does not preclude its spontaneous activities. Indeed, these spontaneous reactions, and in particular the angry reactions of citizens and civil society, are essential for democracy. But there is only so much that these acts can achieve. The most influential thinker of the public sphere, Jürgen Habermas, was acutely aware of the limits of the voice of the global civil society expressed in the public sphere. He argued that discourses do not govern, because the capacity of the public sphere to solve problems on its own is limited. According to Habermas, the public sphere can influence political decision-making, but not in a direct way. In the Habermasian formulation, the opinions of civil society must be given a shape in the forms of decisions by democratically constituted decision-making bodies. He contends that the flow of communication between public opinion formation, institutionalized elections, and legislative decisions is meant to guarantee that influence and communicative power are transformed to legislation into administrative power. So in the end, Habermas ascribes a very limited role to what he calls the public sphere. To him, its role is to work as a warning system with sensors, but it cannot be conceived as an institution, and least of all, not an organization. He argues that the voice of civil society expressed in the public sphere does not aspire to the responsibility of taking political decisions. According to Habermas, and I quote, the communicative structures of the public sphere relieves the public of the burden of decision making. The postponed decisions are reserved for the institutionalized political process. In other words, he claims that civil society does not aspire to have a greater role in democratic decision making. He also suggests that there is a division of labor between the spontaneous civil society and formal political institutions. Jean Drizek agrees with Habermas. He argues that this division of the labor between civil society on one hand and the state on the other does not consign the former to the powerless realm. He claims, in fact, that a number of transmission mechanisms are available and enable public to be translated into administrative power. Similarly, Amy Buckman and Alice Thompson argue that civil society must remain substantially unstructured to allow for free will formation. Habermas has raised two other pertinent objections to the institutionalization of the voice of civil society in our public sphere. His opposition was grounded in two main fears. First, he felt that the public sphere was not as legitimate as democratically elected institutions. And second, he feared that the public sphere would merge with the state. He defined this phenomenon as the statification of society with the neo-corporatist superficialization of the state. Regarding his first fear, Habermas argued that though ideally civil society in the public sphere should influence the process of political decision-making, he suggested that political decisions should be taken by parliaments, by courts, and democratically elected institutions. This justification is this argument is somewhat justified, and it's pertinent. After all, the spontaneous deliberations of civil society are not necessarily democratic. It is often difficult to establish whether the deliberations of civil society are truly representative of the public they are supposed to represent. However, this shortcomings can be addressed by democratization, democratizing civil society, and this can only be done within institutions. Habermas' second fear was also about the threat of fusion between civil society expressed in the public sphere and the state. He feared that institutionalization of the public sphere, for want of a better term, would ultimately result in its absorption or co-optation by the state. And his fear was based in the fact that in these circumstances, the public sphere would lose the ability to counter and challenge the state. But examples from democratic liberation involving a wide range of citizens show that does not need to be the case, because in fact, in many instances, the institutionalization of voices of society resulted not in co-optation, but in participation in decision-making. So I'm not convinced by Habermas' objections. It is also not clear that some institutionalization of civil society is a constraint to free will formation or will always result in co-optation. So it can result in some co-optation if that the institutional design is not correct, but in most cases it doesn't. Indeed, it will require this institutionalization, it will require the setting up of certain rules of engagement, but only those that enforce equality and reciprocity. And it also involves bargaining, negotiation with powerful groups. But that is essentially the nature of politics. All types of politics involve collaboration, bargaining, and negotiation. For these reasons, I am not sure that either Habermas, Drizek, Buckman, and Thompson are right. On the other hand, the division of labor that they propose between the voices of civil society and representative institutions, this division of labor reinforces society's unequal distribution of power and condemns civil societies to a subaltern role. So one way to ensure that the voice of global civil society influences change is to give it more power. And one way of doing it is through institutions. So to argue for the formalization of the voices of civil society is about ensuring that the voices are heard, that they influence decision-making, and that they are involved in enacting change. And the reality is that the unstructured deliberations and expressions of civil society do not guarantee that its voice will be heard in the process of political decision-making. Indeed, often the voice of the public sphere is sidelined at political decision-makers. At best, political representatives cherry-pick the popular issues and causes that they want to champion. Moreover, the spontaneous public sphere does not guarantee that participation will be sufficiently inclusive. As Adamaz himself admitted, the public sphere tends to privilege the dominant, the better organized, and the well-resourced groups in society. And we see that when the very well-organized and well-funded organized social movements of the global north dominate discussions on development, climate justice, and so on over those of the social movements of the global south. And so that is why the voice of civil society needs that proper institutional setting. Its formalization in the liberty institution has the potential to facilitate open and inclusive public discussions and to enable the development of common and democratic positions on issues that then can be proposed by democratic and representative institutions. This will not result in a dramatic change, but it will help to weaken the voices of the powerful. I think the most powerful argument for the formalization of the public sphere was perhaps made by Nancy Fraser. She argues that any conception of civil society that requires a sharp separation between association of civil society and the state condemns the public sphere to the realm of being insignificant. According to Fraser, this separation reflects a limited conception of democracy because, and I quote, it is unable to imagine the forms of self-management, inter-public coordination, and political accountability that are essential to a democratic and egalitarian society. What is needed, she argues, is a post-bourgeois conception that can permit us to envision a greater role for at least some public spheres than mere autonomous opinion formation, removed from authoritative decision-making. So the creation of an institution or institutions that represent the voices of civil society would bring three main benefits. First, it would dilute the influence of powerful actors, thereby giving out access to public deliberation, opinion formation, and decision-making to all participants. This can be achieved by the imposition of formal rules of engagement that insist on the primacy of equality and reciprocity. Operating under such rules, the discursive outcomes of civil society would bring greater visibility to minority views and to less powerful actors. Secondly, this deliberative institution would prioritize or agenda-setting issues and themes to be later considered by representative bodies. A priori, in such a democratic setting, no topical issue would be off limits. Everything would be open for discussion. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the creation of this deliberative forum would render more difficult the process of dismissing the voices of civil society. Within a proper institutional setting, local, regional, national, or transnational forum, the deliberations of the public sphere cannot be easily dismissed because they carry no legitimacy. So if these conditions can be met, then civil society can play a role in political decision-making. This institutionalization of voices of civil society can be done in a variety of ways, and all of them include dialogue and negotiation with other social, political, and economic forces, and which ultimately result in binding decisions. As you know, deliberative democracy is a form of decision-making that is open to all citizens, but which is predicated on the idea of deliberation before voting. Its purpose is to promote an inclusive, egalitarian, and rational form of decision-making, and can operate under many formats, including citizen assemblies, mini publics, participatory budgeting, or any other form of meaningful citizen involvement in policy making. These forms of deliberative democracy, which are not panaceas, they are not the miracle that will solve all those problems. These deliberative forums are very quietly disrupting the power monopolies of professional politicians, traditional political parties, national bureaucracies, and corporate lobbies. And we see that from the participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre in Brazil, to the citizens' assemblies in Ireland, from the Panchayat reforms in the Indian state of Kerala, to the Global Citizens' Assembly at the 2021 COP Summit. We've seen diverse groups of citizens have been changing the global conversation about poverty, inequality, gender, climate justice, and democracy. But more than changing the conversation, these new democratic structures offer genuine power for ordinary citizens. And this is because these forms of deliberative democracy go beyond consultation processes. The results of the citizens' assemblies in Ireland, of the participatory budgeting in Portugal, and of the Plenary reforms in Kerala have resulted in binding decisions that have transformed society. These binding decisions were possible because this new forum created an institutional relationship between civil society organized in the living forums and the institutions of representative democracy. So these models of government work very well at the local level, but I think they can be adopted and adapted at the international level. In fact, organizations like the European Union and the UN have already the practice, as well as the institutional setup, to listen to organized interests on a regular basis to decide their agenda. But I think that this practice should go beyond participation. These transnational bodies should create institutional mechanisms whereby the voices of global civil society, as well as those of national parliaments, regional assemblies, local councils, are able to inform their own deliberations and decision making. So this is what I call the institutionalization of voice. And this is a form of institutionalizing the voice of civil society, which can contribute for the projection of an effective and powerful voice that can lead to transformative change. So I'm going to conclude by going back to Hirschman. He said that voice is all that members of human societies have to work with, which affect change. But his word should not be taken as an admission of weakness, because voice is not the only power that citizens possess. Voice in itself is power. Throughout history, the organized voices of social movements and human communities have been powerful agents of change. There is no reason why this shouldn't continue to be the case, but this time powered by institutions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Eunice, for this excellent talk. I share your concerns, and I have to say I fully agree with your assessment. I didn't realize how close we were intellectually in terms of how we think about these movements. I'll open the room to questions in a second, but first I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair and ask the first question. And the question is concerned with technology. Going back to those movements that were not so successful in challenging neoliberalism post 2008 kinds of movements like Occupy, Indignados, and then on the side of social theory, theorists like Manuel Castells, for instance, fetishizing technology, fetishizing networks as allegedly creating conditions for this absolute horizontality and giving this absolute authentic voice to social movements. And in my view, it hasn't really worked that well, right? To some extent, these movements focused more on how they were saying things rather than what they were actually wanting to say or what they wanted to achieve. What's your view on the role of technology communication? How can social movements use them to prevent being sort of hijacked by this technology?
Yes, that's a really important question. So I think my first and kind of immediate response is that revolutions are done by people, not by machines, not by telephones or Xerox machines. So this being said, technology is a great help. And we've seen how, for instance, the movement for democracy was greatly helped by the spread of literacy, and that was essentially the printing press that also allowed for the spread of literacy. So, and circulation of mass circulation pamphlets, newspapers, and so on. But this requires actually groups of individuals who are brave and courageous in one way to sometimes risk their lives to challenge the status quo. With social media can help to organize movements and activities transnationally. So it can be a great tool for organization, for recruitment, for mobilization of certain issues. One interesting aspect of that kind of mobilization was actually brought about by research by Alan Margetts, who showed that this is during the Arab Spring, the use of technology enabled the emergence of a different type of activist. The kind of activist was normally absent from social movements. He brought former women to those movements, whereas before social movements were very much male dominated. So it is, I think, technology is can be a fantastic tool, but the key ingredient for social change is human action, is human, it's the courage of human beings to challenge established powers.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions? I bring the microphone to you.
I think I probably could have shouted across the room as well. Thank you for that very, very interesting talk. I got a lot of very valuable notes. I just want to follow up actually with the first question. Do you think that the technology makes it easier for these social movements to be infiltrated or hijacked by those who would try to counter what the movement was trying to do?
Yes, I think so. I remember reading about the Arab Spring and how at some stage the activists were resorting back to paper in order not to be caught by the authorities. So there is a very big risk, and now with the happening of networks, sites, and so on, it means that information is readily available, and of course, authorities, the police, the repressive apparatus of the state has very sophisticated tools essentially to monitor the activities of the citizens. We've seen that already. Well, we've seen this in the democracy like Britain during the coronation of the king, where Republican activists were actually caught and they were arrested even before they had even put on a placard outside because they had received information from somewhere. They were probably hacking people's phones, hacking their WhatsApp messages and so on, to essentially know where they were going to be and essentially stop any kind of activity. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much. It was a very inspiring talk, and I really want to be convinced in a way. But I must say that I have a problem with that because the concept of civil society that you use and we often use in our research assumes that civil society is a good thing in the sense that it's a community of people who share belief in equality, pluralism, and so on and so forth. So, but the problem is, and I'm saying that as a person who has studied anti-gender movements in the last couple of years, that it's a very optimistic view, I would say. And there is a more talk now about liberal civil society or, well, different types of civil society. And I'm saying civil society both in terms of a grassroots engagement and also in terms of organizational forms, but also a self-identity of the activists, right? So my question is how to fit that into your analysis, because I think that making this assumption that civil society is always good and always shares a set of values which are good for democracy, basically, however we will define that, leads us astray. And I'm saying that recognizing that, for example, in Poland, where I come from, many of those organizations are gongoes or are sort of elite established organizations, but many of those are actually grassroots organizations, and they sometimes have quite fascist views. So what about that?
Thank you. That's a really very good question. I won't have kind of a ready-made answer to that. It is absolutely important, and you are absolutely right that there are a lot of very liberal voices in civil society. But I would say that democratic deliberation, and in particular the processes of democratic deliberation, would be a way of, well, they have to be included in the conversation because hiding them and pretending that they do not exist, I don't think it solves any problems. The assumptions of the liberation is that free, but also moderated conversations, so essentially not allowing certain groups to dominate conversations. The assumptions of that liberation is that you're going to have a transformation of practices, that people can change their minds while they are listening to rival voices. And what we have that component of the civil society, the liberal voices that actually dominate our public sphere at the moment. I don't think it's only Poland, I think it is very, very, very widespread. Well, behind them, there are also extremely powerful, extremely well-resourced lobbies who are funding the activities of those groups. And what we create is not really a conversation, it's not really a deliberation, it's a convention of action. It's essentially calling and addressing and targeting people's worst instincts and worst fears, as opposed to having a conversation. And so the discussions, the deliberations I would propose are not those that are being conducted at this moment in TV studios, which essentially the way that the media operates is about having fights and people essentially who can shout the loudest wins the debate. But the principles of democratic deliberation are actually about bringing together in the room not people that share the same viewpoints, the same worldviews, but who come from very diverse backgrounds. And while they are listening, while they are hearing and being exposed to other experiences, other voices, they may change their minds. Maybe this is a kind of an optimistic view, but this is essentially, I believe in that the promise that there will be democracy, especially when tackling these very divided issues, tackling those areas of public life where people have such extreme views and so such opposite views. This is where the potential for the mainstreaming of public opinion can be achieved. And I think there's been some research done by social psychologists that show that if you put in a room people, a very diverse range of people, the result of that discussion is going to be a mainstreaming towards the center. Whereas if you put in a room people who have just opposing views, what happens is a kind of the reinforcement of that polarization. So hopefully, if there is an investment in this kind of political forum, maybe those very angry and liberal voices can be transformed, not silenced, but transformed. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
I hope you're right.
I hope you.
First of all, thank you for your conference. It's been very inspiring. My name is Gabriel. I am a postdoc fellow on international studies, and my focus of research is on global governance. So I was thinking during the presentation that if we put this into a broader scale, considering we are passing by a moment where the institutions are somehow under check in terms of performance and also in terms of credibility, I share with you the view that institutional ways is a path in order to achieve advances. But how do you see nowadays in terms of these credibility and performance challenge that the role of institutions can be understood nowadays?
Thank you for that question. I think there is the ideas around liberty democracy have never been as current as now. There's lots and lots and lots of experiments around the world using different models. And I think there is the moment, there's a kind of that window of opportunity, the moment has come for that form of decision making, precisely because the typical classical institutions of representative democracy are under strain. We've seen, our parliaments essentially becoming powerless institutions in the hands of very powerful executives. We see the politicization of the judiciary in many countries. We see also corporate media and the mainstream media gain an incredible power over decision making. So there is space, and I think there is an openness at the moment to try to experiment with different forms of institutional decision making. And I remember reading many years ago when I was in my PhD, the cosmopolitan democracy model of David Hell and Daniele Akibuji. And I think that at the time that model was very much dismissed as, this is kind of utopia. But I think that we are not far. For instance, when you look at the way that the European Union is operating and is already developing those dialogues with civil society, this can be pushed further. And it can be done in a serious way. There are, of course, serious obstacles, because how do you engage millions of citizens that represent a whole continent or the whole world? It is difficult. The questions and problems of representation, problems of scale exist. But I don't think that they are unsurmountable. So at the moment, I am bringing on to the idea that there is openness to reform democracy, to accept that representative democracy has serious limitations, and the way to address these limitations is actually to open space for the voices of citizens to come forward and to bypass political parties, or to become another voice besides political parties, which organized unions and so on. So widen the space for political decision making.
One more question.
Hello, my name is Deidre Neal, and my research is around psychobiological and psychohistorical development in leaders. So my question to you is around sustainability, right, of these ideas and these voices of social change that we see. They do make progress in that, but to me, it's the sustainability of those changes when you have institutions that are heavily tied to these historical tropes and traditions. So I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts were about that.
Yes, well, it's a very difficult question. It is how I think that they have to be open, and there has to be pressure for that change. I do not believe that that institutions are unreformable, and that traditional forms of life are they are permanent, they stay there forever. I come from Portugal. 50 years ago, my country was a dictatorship. Women could not open bank accounts. There was no right to divorce, and so on. There were very few women at university. And Portugal is not a paradise by any stretch of the imagination. But the country has changed tremendously, and the institutions have changed tremendously. They're still extremely conservative, the most inefficient bureaucracy with cultural traits still of the former regime. So that culture is the thing that takes the longer to change. That happens, change happens. So if there is pressure from civil society, and if civil society can also persuade and engage in that campaign all the more institutional and powerful voices, because you need those sponsors. Having those powerful sponsors helps. This is a further addition to that campaign, kind of opening up the political institutions that have been so resistant to change.
We have space for one more question, but it will have to be quick. There are quite a few. I don't know who's first. Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. I teach at the University of Waterloo, so my question is at a different scale. How do you teach in a classroom when you have a young man who just came in 3 weeks ago or so into the classroom on campus, and took out 2 knives and attacked the professor and 2 students. This was in a class of philosophy of gender. So how do you allow for voice in a classroom where the stakes are very high and people's personal state is at stake? I have a gay friend who taught engineers how to communicate. You can all laugh about that. But she taught these young men, and they are Trump supporters, and 3 of them in a row gave presentations about the myth of the gender gap. How do you deal with that at the level of the classroom?
Well, it's quite the horrible, quite a horrible experience. I had one experience, not of an attack, but actually of a student carrying a knife this big, not only in classroom, but trying to get to Parliament with a knife this big in her bag. Well, I think it is, again, you know, the institutions that I was talking about are those institutions that have, they are important because they have rules of engagement. And so one of the very key rule of engagement in a democratic deliberative forum is, of course, respect. And of course, non-violence, and respect means non-violence. So, you know, why would that person carry knives? It is extraordinary. We can, I don't think that, but I don't think there's also an institution solution for somebody to break the laws. This is a far more ambitious project that requires the whole engagement of society, of other political institutions that actually persuade young men not to carry knives and attack their instructors, because they do not feel that they are being unfair and let down by the world as it is. I'm so sorry for giving such an imperfect answer.
So we will manage this final question. I hope I'm not disappointed.
I hope it's going to be the final question. And thank you for bringing that Waterloo situation. You know, I teach at Dalhousie University in Halifax, and we were shocked. I was thinking about locking my doors when I would class to teach, but I don't know if that's going to work or not. I just want to go back to the idea of crisis and how crisis opens. You know, you mentioned transformative change, right? I'm a little bit very skeptic about this notion of crisis, because crisis can be either natural or man-made, right? And the transformative change that crisis brings is also can be positive or negative, and tying into the idea of the powerful people, you know. So the less powerful are going to really be the ones who are victims of this. And I've seen that what happened during the technical arena in the States, when George Bush said crisis is the best, you know, it's the time for us to actually look at ideas that were not, you know, that were refused in the past. And New Orleans is completely different than the poor folks really lost. So I just want to bring this up and say the crisis could be good, but crisis can also be bad, and crisis can be man-made, not natural. And we have this issue going on over the world where we have with the oil crisis. There is oil, but the producers don't want to pump out oil. So what do? We pay more money, right? We get aid. There is food. In Canada, we had this issue where there's issues with transportation, for food distribution, and the prices of food went up. You know, and the causes crisis, so the price went up. People are to complain. We had the issue with bread in Canada recently too, where the bread companies conspired and created a crisis just to up the price, right? So crisis can be, if it's a natural crisis, yes, but what we have to worry about is this man-made crisis just for the purpose of, you know, gains. And that's one of the things that we're going.
Well, all the crises, as you said, all the crises that we've experienced are all man-made. So they can be unmade. So essentially, there's the whole question of the agency is there. The problem, and I think this is what I was trying to say with bringing people home. They open up windows of opportunity to change, but more often than not, that window of opportunity closes and change did not happen. to essentially have the reinforcement of the forces, the traditions, the policies that were already there. So more often than not, crises end up in being missed opportunities to change. So the point, how can then citizens, social movements, civil society can actually act as a countervailing power to those existing powers that benefit from the status quo. The point is about organizing, it's about organizing voice in a way that voice can be heard and affect change. That's essentially what I try to say with my talk. Citizens have a great ability to change. I think the humanity's history of the last 200 years, and I think even before, but this would have been periods of immense social transformations. And that has happened because of human beings who are, and often the powerless who are exercising their agency. It requires a lot of courage, it requires a lot of patience, but I think it requires a kind of a determination and not giving up and believing that we can't do anything about it, because that's exactly what they want us to believe, that we cannot do anything about it. This is the way that the world is.
Thank you very much. We have to. There will be time during lunch to ask more questions. Thank you very much. We have this gesture of appreciation to you. Thanks a lot. Okay, I just wanted to pay